My early education became more exciting as the years rolled by. During the primary school days, I enjoyed the games we played in the playground, which was layered with tiny rounded stones. Later, I played soccer and conducted science experiments in the laboratory, where I discovered static electricity producing equipment. Yet it all felt so familiar, as if I had been working with them not so long ago. I was already talking about how they worked, thus stunning some of my teachers about how I, the little primary school kid, knew all these things before they even spoke about them. At high school, I was interested in human anatomy, art, and making music. It generally meant so much to me, even at that young age. This is also when I discovered wire recording equipment from a very long time ago, and to my surprise, my classroom teacher gave me a small bobbin of recorded wires to keep. During my adult years, when experimenting with old antiquities, I was able to transfer those extremely valuable recordings onto reel-to-reel tapes. Although on Monday mornings we assembled to sing hymns and the national anthem, I was neither interested nor very keen about them. I preferred to remain in the classroom. It was very cold in the winter's chill, and we used to stand by the hot steam heaters, which were warmed by a giant furnace under the school. Eventually, when the classrooms were sufficiently warm, everybody entered the old building and took their seats with the usual commotion. I was to discover similarities of such familiar trends and school activities with other parts of the European continent. It was the same everywhere I have been. Some of the hymns sung in those days were either religious or nationalistic. The young were constantly encouraged to show their respect to the national flag and national heroes, who were adored and worshipped. If not national heroes, either religious figures or a religious deity was worshipped when assembled in the schoolyard. I learnt about the history of nations, somewhat in an extremely biased way, which I later realized when an adult. It seemed that almost all humans lived to fight, engage in conflicts, and excitedly die on battlegrounds. Even their holy scriptures were full of dark stories. Every part of the human history I was learning about was full of bloodshed and destruction. National heroes had been fighting the enemy comprised of other humans, sacrificing their lives for our nation's survival and evolvement. Some of my classmates were so excited about the prospect of becoming a soldier to fight for their nation. It was probably the only noble thing they were interested in. However, to me, at that young age, it did not make any sense, because I thought these young humans like me would be far better off if they only aimed to live and learn to advance, rather than sacrifice themselves, doing more beneficial things for the world and humanity. I saw too many unhappy and miserable people. Some had no home, others lived on the streets and were starving. Others had missing limbs and sickly. Whenever I met people who were poor or begging for bread, my heart went out to them. I always offered my packed school lunch or sandwiches to them, for I was so happy to see people smile. Occasionally I spoke about these matters with my brother, but I was not sure whether he felt the same way. On the other hand, my childhood has been saturated with many colorful dreams. I dreamt of other worlds, space, stars, and a better future. It was also necessary to escape the harsh realities surrounding me while hoping for better things, wondering if the world was to remain just the same in utter madness as it was then. Mark 4:22 states, "For there is nothing hid, except to be made manifest, nor is anything secret, except to come to light." I was immensely interested in all things, shapes, colors, sounds, images, faces of people, and even mechanical technology. In some peculiar sense, I was making comparisons and analyzing what I seemed to have left behind. I was endeavoring to discover some meaning behind all those things and events. In other words, I was attempting to comprehend my own complex world. This trend was to last for the rest of my life. My brother had very similar tendencies, but was extremely shy about expressing himself. He too has been subjected to many downgrading comments by some of our relatives about his intelligence and being very thin, like a sardine lost in the sea, thus making him lack in self-confidence. Since they were still very young themselves, did our cousins realize how much hurt they caused? I felt very hurt, but preferred to ignore them as if they did not exist. This was not due to my disliking them, but considering them as just being very naive. This has helped me greatly not to fall into that same trap. The younger of the two was 8 years older than me and 10 years older than my brother. But our mother took no note of their sarcasm, perhaps believing that they were older than us, therefore supremely intelligent, for after all, they were her favorites, whom she worshipped. When there were any issues in regard to us boys' personal development, or when we were discovering all about our bodies as we matured, she always attempted to involve them in order for them to teach us the right way, in the process thoroughly embarrassing us without realizing it. That may be due to her not being educated enough about the nature of boys, or having no partner to rely on to teach us right from wrong. In theory, it could also have been the way she was brought up. My brother and I were very similar to each other, so no wonder many others thought we were twins. Even our interests were almost identical. We were both keenly interested in the sky, the stars, and travel into space. We were both very adventurous. Furthermore, when very young, I was keenly interested in discovering how everything made the human body function, and found the difference between girls and boys fascinating. One day in our backyard, I invited a number of girls from the neighborhood to play a game of doctors and nurses. I remember asking them to take their knickers off and urinate on the ground to see how they were doing it. Some had a steady stream, while others got their legs wet. Noticing what was happening through the back window, my mother chastised me. The girls were immediately sent home, and my cousins notified forthwith to talk to me about what immoral things I was engaged in. However, I had no evil intent, just being a very curious young boy. I did not even know about what was normally and ritually performed between the sexes when they were mature. I remember being treated as an immoral and rebellious child. It may have been thought a terrible and sinful act on religious grounds. With the encouragement of my aunt and one of my grandmothers, I was forced to declare my sins to the parish priest. Consequently, it encouraged me to conduct my unique experiments more often, only in secret from then on. Another pastime I invented was originally an experiment. I was beginning to discover the reality of the cause and effect principle. I was also observing the behavior patterns of common houseflies, and could not fathom why they were part of life around me. Soon I discovered, much to my mother's disgust, how to catch them by their legs. It was so easy, after attracting them to where I wanted them to be, just by thinking about their movements or imposing my own will. Then I tried colored threads of cotton on their waists at short lengths, delicately and carefully, so as not to hurt them. I would then release them, and they made a beautiful display of color as they flew all around the room, much to the surprise and delight of my mother's clients and visitors. It seemed the flies did not mind the experience. Besides, they were at least doing something better than just annoying people, entertaining them. At other times, my brother and I had many exciting and shared dreams. It sounds strange, does it not? But it is true. Let me tell you just one of them, as I remembered, and he also confirmed. One morning, I woke up and told Haldon about our flight together to the moon in a dream. I noticed him floating just beside me. He immediately confirmed exactly what he experienced during that flight, and told me he was often behind me. We shared all we remembered with each other. I was not surprised, and neither was he. We both flew to the moon, and when closer gazed upon the craters, rocks, and soft sandy plains. We looked at the earth from that distance. It was so blue and beautiful. It seemed we had crash-landed on the lunar rocks, but were unheard. In reality, it was more real than that. My brother looked a little worried then, and I decided to draw the image of the moon as I remembered, with all its details on a piece of paper. When I showed him that image, he screamed and showed signs of fear. Our mother rushed to the rescue as usual, and told him that it was only a picture, but nothing calmed him down. Whenever I attempted to show him that image, he cried and screamed, so I decided to hide it. However, in those days no man had ever stepped on the moon's surface, and it wasn't to be until the late 1960s. Interestingly, the image I drew after our shared dream showed the same or similar features as the astronauts photographed. Shortly after our shared outing, I thought that perhaps the experience of falling onto the moon's surface triggered a frightening memory of the occasion for my brother. Or was it perhaps some other past tragic event he may have recalled? Did the image I drew remind him of someone in his possible past? When we made mention of our unique journey to our mother, for she was the only person around us who would listen, she took it as being young boys' vivid imaginations. But I knew that the telescope my brother and I invented using our grandmother's glasses showed a vista that we had actually experienced in our unique dream. Even this experience our mother felt she had to share with her favorite nephews, Antoine and Georg, considering them being more mature and more understanding of these matters. Later I found them ridiculing my drawing of the moon. They tried to convince us that it was only a dream, and that we should not take it seriously like idiots. According to our mother, they always had to be right. Despite all that, I knew she loved us and did everything possible for our health and happiness, for which I am eternally grateful. Being primary school students, we could relate our stories, feelings, and dreams a lot easier to others, but never to our cousins. I still remember how I climbed on top of my mother's Singer sewing machine and bumped my head on the bobbin spindle, which pierced through my left eyebrow, passing the eyeball. I remember how the blood gashed out from the hole I had made, and how she panicked, thinking that I had probably damaged my brain, or blinded my left eye. I remember it being stitched at the hospital, and wore an eye patch for a while, but could not wait until they took it off. This happened long before I started my schooling, and I still carry the mark. It is a tiny scar hidden under my eyebrow, although it has not been a significant feature in identification. My brother and I did extremely well at school with our mother's much appreciated help, while our father was totally divorced from all his responsibilities, only caring for his own special interests, which we were not expected to know anything about. As far as he was concerned, amongst his only known interests, his horse racing and gambling habits were the most meaningful. Personally, if I had a chance before my entry into the world, I would have chosen someone more caring, more responsible for a father. Is there perhaps anything like that, choosing one's parents before being born? If that was the case, what could have been the reason for such an undertaking on my part? Was it to learn or teach someone wisdom, or else I must have been drunk when making that decision? However, As the years rolled by, I realized that his presence was nothing more than providing one of his sperm for his wife's pregnancy to enable the fetus to develop and become me in this world. I can say the same thing for my brother. This way, our so-called father figure has fulfilled a necessary human task. In fact, his later behavior declared just that. Our mother, on the other hand, preferred to think of her marriage as her unfortunate destiny, insisting on staying with him, who never had time for his family and was full of resentment. She did not want us to grow up without him, believing that every child needed their father, sacrificing herself, her own freedom, and happiness. She may have felt it her duty to protect her family's traditional values. Strangely, she hoped that he too would learn, mature, and become a good father. I feel that she was living in a fool's paradise, knowing deep down that he would never change. But what made him the way he was? Was it due to what he had experienced in his military days on assignment somewhere in the middle of an awful war? Was it due to being a prisoner of war, where he had seen and experienced terrible things? We were never to know. It was a secret kept hidden from us. I am certain that our mother knew a lot of things, but did not want us to discover about those issues. Just get on with our lives. At times, our father behaved almost like a haunted person, hiding his true self. I heard stories about him fighting alongside the French legionaries, and was subjected to some humanly unacceptable situations, thus developing the characteristics which we became familiar with. There were many things said, but how much was true or real? We heard that he had held commanding position, but then spent time in Istanbul in his unfortunate ways, until his relatives intervened. If he had served in the Turkish army, however, he would certainly not have been put in a position of command, being of an Armenian background. I remember him presenting me with a handwritten note in French, in which he was begging the authorities to consider his situation on humanitarian grounds, for he would love to return. What indeed was he begging for? And where, in reality, did he want to return to? I had no idea. He asked me to take it to certain authorities, or better still, he would send it in himself. When I spoke about it to my mother, although he insisted that I should not speak of it, her response was, "Just ignore it, and there can be nothing of concern." Ever since then, nothing further was said, and I simply kept it a secret, which I preferred not to know anything about. Another interesting issue was that my mother loved to speak French to me, adored French language, and was keenly interested in French fashion magazines. I clearly remember her words when she often repeated, "Je t'aime, enfant, mon frère." When I was very young, she taught me how to improve my speech and speak properly, and sometimes she did so in Armenian, Turkish, and Arabic. But whilst staying in Turkey, things were different. She, like her sister and other relatives, preferred to live just the same as the locals, never wanting her true background to be discovered. Armenians, and especially those from the European continent, constantly lived in fear in case they were found out as belonging to a minority group. It was considered a crime, and, when looking at it from an Islamic way of thinking, it was a great sin. When I was 8 years old, my brother and I invented our own languages. This way, we could correspond and understand each other, even having a little gossip, without anybody becoming aware of what we were talking about. That was so unique and so special to us. Some of the words we used were the backward spelling of a number of languages we were subjected to at home. They were a mixture of French, Armenian, English, and even Turkish. I was so incredibly keen to speak a different language, even at that age, which led me to learn several more in my adult years. I still remember so clearly when we were invited to a party where we were only to watch people having fun from the rooftop of my aunt's address. I was standing on the balcony and, for a joke, recited a poem I had invented in a language which I made up for fun, whereupon a young Turkish girl in the neighbor's courtyard started to swear, shouting, "The enemy has landed here. Bring my shotgun. I want to kill that bastard." Upon which my aunt hastily came out onto the balcony, asking what the problem was, and was told she should bring the dog to the balcony so that the girl could shoot the bastard. Although she was told that the young boy was only joking and did not really speak the enemy's tongue, she obviously hated the foreign dogs and could not be calmed. I rushed indoors, my hair standing on end. I was only joking, and sadly learned how not to behave in that most restrictive country. Oh, how much I wanted to run away from it all. However, it never deterred me from learning a different language. For some reason, I was particularly interested to learn English, and possibly German by listening to the radio, or trying to understand the written languages from library books with the aid of dictionaries. Speaking of German, some beautiful German girls in my mother's fashion magazines were interesting me a lot. I felt just the same way about the images of gorgeous English girls, and thought they could be the real angels on earth, and therefore the language they spoke had to be the language of the angels. I believed it to be that way until I discovered what that lovely language really was, and where it originated from. I remember my mother's Burda fashion magazines, printed in German and English. When looking at those girls' images, to me, they appeared a little too reddish with their skin color without realizing the possibility of print-related technologies, thus making me think that perhaps Germans belonged to a red-skinned race. Later I was to learn who, in reality, the red-skinned people were, but I was yet to learn what Germans looked like. To my young mind, the English looked best of them all. I was fascinated with some of their pure white looks. This may be why I wanted to learn those languages. However, I was yet to discover other colorful races, and the prospect of doing so was exciting. Furthermore, all the comic books I was reading and collecting were in English, and all the exciting films at the cinema were also in that language. When I watched those westerns in the movies, I felt very sad for the Indians, as they were always killed in them. They alone made me compare them with the race I represented when in Turkey. In fact, I felt terribly embarrassed for being an Armenian in that country. For reasons I could not fully understand, the American natives in those films became closer to my heart, and I wished I could help them live a good life. As I grew older, I felt a little more closeness towards them, but could not say why. Did I have a past life experience as one of those natives, perhaps? I was yet to learn the truth in regard to Native Americans. As you may have guessed, I could no longer tolerate those movies, the same as war films. and instead I began to show more interest in science fiction. Interestingly, my interest in English became so intense that I needed to learn to speak and express myself in that language quickly. I was becoming very frustrated when looking at those wonderful magazines and films, yet unable to follow them completely. I wanted to talk to those angels, speaking the angels' language. I was to learn many things about angels, but certainly not how religious people described them. Our mother and grandmothers often talked about them. Discovering my intense interest in learning English, my mother employed an American war veteran living nearby who was willing to teach me. He was elderly and regularly visited us just to talk. He enjoyed the Turkish-Armenian Greek coffee and sweets, which the girls working for my mother made. He started to teach me English during the school holidays and on some weekends, concentrating on the grammar and American speech patterns. It was interesting, but too hard to twist my tongue to sound right. In reality, I was learning American, and it was not the angel's tongue. The language was beautiful, but there was something drastically missing. That gentleman was extremely kind and ever ready to spend more time in teaching. And I am certainly very thankful to him. He had a characteristic which baffled us. He did not know what honey was, only learning about it when he tasted it for the first time at our house. One day he was not able to come, probably due to ill health or other personal reasons. He may have decided to go back to the States. Or was it my mother's decision not to continue? I really had no idea. I later started to learn English from an English tutor. Now I could pronounce the words more easily, creating long and complicated sentences. I was happy, for I started to speak the language of the angels and began to understand, even translate the books I borrowed from the English library. I could now relate to all those American books and magazines about astronomy as well. It was like coming back home, even when I was not home. This also encouraged my brother to be interested in learning English. During my higher education days, I was very successful in the English language course and was able to teach other friends simple phrases at school. However, I was a little naughty, helping them to pass their English exams. Even during our primary school days, we often frequented other American or English cultural lending libraries, even though my comprehension of the language was limited without the use of dictionaries. I borrowed many books, particularly on subjects of astronomy, space exploration, and flight. At high school, I borrowed literature on history in regard to the beginnings of human civilizations. This not only helped me and my brother to improve our learning more about the language of the angels, but also taught us all about the exciting prospects of flight and the beauty of other galactic and planetary systems. By doing so, it felt as if we were still connected to our beginnings outside the Earthian realm. I always believed that every one of us came from the stars. For my brother and me, it was like touching home and remembering our past. We were two unusual young boys whose interests were different. For others around us, we had boyish interests and were regarded as dreamers. During my high school days, I organized a space club and rocket club and started to publish small pamphlets about space exploration and also about what others around the world were trying to achieve. The subjects I covered were usually on journeying to the moon, and other planets within our solar system. I used to borrow 16mm films documenting the subjects I was keenly interested in, showing them to the rest of the school, thus exciting the other students and younger teachers. Some of the older teachers were not pleased, but could do nothing about it. I even took the projectors I borrowed from the American library home and showed a few of those films at our aunt's place, to the amazement of our cousins, who forever considered my brother and me as idiotic and brainless boys. Perhaps it made them feel superior, and they may have been reflecting our father. Our mother, on the other hand, showed us ways to appreciate color and visual design, and that started my interest in drawing and painting. I remember the colorful and glossy Russian calendar our father once brought home. It had been given to him as a Christmas and New Year's gift, depicting the mining industry in Russia. It had illustrations of caverns dug in the depths and toy workers happily digging for coal and other worthy minerals. It looked so exciting that it created the impression that our father was probably changing for the better. He smiled, and it meant the world to us, but it did not last long, for soon he was back to his usual self. On another occasion, he brought some color pencils home, obviously given to him to pass on to us. They were colorful and shiny, made by Faber-Castell. We were so happy until, of course, he told me what I should do with them, literally telling me to stick them into my arse. You can imagine how it made me feel. I thought that maybe I should do that and show him how it looked, just to embarrass him, but I was not going to sink to that level. At the next opportunity I could perhaps tell him that he should keep his color pencils and stick them up his own arse. However, I would probably face the risk of being hit. That opportunity did arise, and I told him just that. He said nothing, perhaps shocked about that response from me, the young boy he disliked. He ate, drank, and always kept away, completely uninterested in us. Sadly, we always felt that, in truth, we had no father. Our mother always filled the gap and became both parents. Another memory, which still plagues me, originates from my primary school days. There were times when I was laughed at by a number of other boys because I had curly reddish hair and looked different. When it was cold and frosty, I used to cover my head with a scarf, as my mother insisted. Obviously, she did not want us to develop head colds. I did not take things too seriously even when they called me a girly boy. There were those who tried to bully me, but could not get anywhere with their efforts, instead becoming friends. I suppose I had a very different effect on them. For instance, when a bully approached me, I kept extremely cool, calmly suggesting the hardest thing for them to do, and instead of fighting, we could become good friends. Why did one need to create enemies? As one can see, my influence on others had to be always different. That was, and still is, my nature. Wherever I go, peace has to accompany me, for peace is still my best friend. Although I almost always enjoyed sporting activities, my main interest remained more academic and artistic. I loved discoveries of and learning about new things, as well as inventing. Drawing images of things and people around me was one of my prime interests. During the late 1950s, I was considered to be one of the taller boys, and encouraged to play basketball. Some others thought that I must be in a more senior class, perhaps even a student at high school when I was still at primary. When subjected to exams during my high school days, my knowledge was considered above average, and they recommended putting me in a more advanced class. But there were also some teachers who wanted to fail me, perhaps due to racial factors, without success. I have been told, not only by a number of educators, but also others like my mother's friends, that I apparently had an unusually strong presence. But at the same time, I could not understand what all the fuss was about. This trend remained for a long while, although I always avoided making big waves. On the other hand, our father, as well as our cousins, considered me and my brother as being completely brainless weaklings. We both never bothered to correct this misconception. As for me, I preferred to remain completely neutral, believing that they too would one day discover that what they popularly desired to downgrade or underestimate was not as they imagined. On the contrary, even then I could only accept everyone as they were. I suppose that by laughing at us and considering me as a joke figure, they imagined themselves as being supreme. Were they not older and supposedly wiser, partially being encouraged to feel that way by my mother? I really feel that my first cousin, even now in his mature age, still feels the same as he once did, for he never contacts me or responds to my correspondence, yet still communicates with my brother. He may have different issues of personal concern. However, as far as I'm concerned, he remains a distant foreigner. And that is most certainly his choice. I favorably remember when my aunt, mother, brother, and I went to see a film in the city. We were ushered to the presidential seats in a reserved balcony. This was where only dignitaries would be allowed. Every time we have been ushered into such reserved seats, I was very surprised. When everybody in the audience turned to us in reverence, it made me feel a little unnerved. And whenever I questioned it, neither my aunt nor mother would explain anything other than deliberately asking if we had enjoyed the film. But the films they chose were mainly of the romantic kind, and we boys were not really interested in them. I personally preferred historic or science fiction. What interested me most was that whilst people from the audience tried to reach and talk to us, bodyguards stopped them. I could not understand what was going on. Obviously, they had no idea about our real background. There were a number of occasions when we were taken in black limousines with luxurious interiors to places where some important people were gathered. There were small orchestras with a grand piano playing classical music of the most beautiful kind. The only response from my aunt, when questioned why everybody was so beautifully dressed, talking to each other with so much respect and following a certain etiquette, was just a smile and a soft whisper that one day I would understand. I have still not discovered anything extraordinary yet, and am puzzled. Obviously, there was something about my parents I was not to question. Those rather interesting occasions kept happening from time to time, but our father, for some unknown reason, never wanted to share the experience. One other intriguing issue that occupied my mind was when my mother made mention of something even more puzzling. She told me that we should, in reality, be dwelling in a mansion, or perhaps a palace, but nothing could be done about it now. We needed to accept what was and what our probable future would be. I was unsure what it meant. I could not question her, for she would never again talk about it. Neither she nor her sister spoke anything of it any more, and they appeared to have made a vow. I could not understand the whole situation then, and still cannot. It simply remains a secret. She was neither joking nor responding to my attitude towards our living standards, or the humble dwelling we occupied at the time. But in reality, I rather liked the rustic looks of things therein. At one stage, when still very young, and living on the other side of the city, on one fiery occasion of frustration, I just walked away from the situation to escape imminent chastisement. I walked along unending roads for hours to my aunt's address on the opposite side of town. By doing so, I caused a huge stir and anxiety, although it was not my intention. My mother must have panicked, inquiring through the police. A search party was apparently sent out to look for me, but I was already at my destination, where my aunt thought I must have taken the bus, although that was not the case, for I had walked the whole way. My aunt had already been in touch with her sister, who was worried and fearful. When my mother finally arrived, she expressed her sadness in a few simple words. She advised me not to do anything like that ever again, for she was so worried. I knew I should not have done so, but I did, and that was it.